Heard any good stories lately? Throughout Illinois, there are many accounts of the unusual, the unbelievable, the supernatural. Many of these legends have roots in actual events, and some will tell you that there is more than a grain of truth in most. So let's travel down a few roadways and discover the truth together. You may not believe in ghosts, eerie lights, and witches, but it's easy to be a naysayer in the comfort and safety of home. Our first destination is the legend of the Purple Head Bridge, which spans the Wabash River between Illinois and Indiana. This extremely narrow bridge is not for the claustrophobic, nor for those who fear disembodied, floating heads.
We actually drove the bridge. It's 1,400 feet long, one lane. So it's a toll bridge, pay $1.50 to get across it. It was built in the late 1800s, and it was made for the railroad. And the railroad, kind of stingy at times, they didn't maintain it well. Like, they wouldn't demolish the whole span. They just redo certain parts that needed attention. Well, in I'd say maybe the 1950s or so, the railroad gave it up. And a few years later, a farmer by the name of Stengel purchased the bridge. And he thought he'd make that into a money-making venture, because this bridge is between St. Francisville, Illinois, and Vincennes, Indiana, sort of the Wabash River. And originally it was called the Wabash Cannonball Bridge. Well, after the farmer bought it, it became known as the Stengel Bridge. Now, there is a haunting associated with it, and that's why it's called the Purple Head Bridge now. So what this farmer did, he took up the railroad rails and moved them to the sides to use of guardrails. He put down wooden planking for cars and trucks to drive over. Like I said, it's I think it's 7 spans. Total length is 1,441 feet. Very narrow. I mean, you can just barely drive across in your own car. So you're sitting there and you've got to look way down there, make sure there's nothing coming, because if you meet someone's going to have to back up. And I know it wouldn't be me, because I don't back up that well. But the theories behind the haunting on it, there's several different ones. One story goes back to the French and Indian War. Of course, the bridge wasn't there at the time. And a lot of the settlers, soldiers, and Indians killed in battle there weren't properly buried. So they'd take the bodies and just toss them in the Wabash River, and they'd float off. Well, there's an Indian shaman from one of the local tribes. He was killed in the battle, and he was one of the bodies thrown into the river. Now, locals say if you drive across the bridge, of course it's always at midnight, park somewhere near the middle, look in your rearview mirror, and you'll see this bloated purple head rise up out of the river through the trestles of the bridge. And it's a luminous face of this Indian shaman just crying and pleading for someone to find his body and give it proper burial. Okay. Now, another version of the Purple Head is many years ago, this distraught man went out there. He's going to kill himself. So he got a rope, tied it to the side of the bridge, put it around his neck, and he jumped. Well, he misjudged the length of the rope. It was too long of a drop, and it jerked its head off. Of course, they found his body, never found his head. So once again, go out to the bridge, park on it, honk your horn 3 times, and you'll see this purple head float up out of the trestle and try to chase you down off the bridge. It's a pretty interesting story there. I'd recommend the trip.
Greenwood Cemetery, Decatur, Illinois. At first glance, you're run-of-the-mill, park-like burial ground. But locals know of the tales of anomalous lights, Civil War undead, creatures in the woods, grave robbers, and a history of flooding in the area formerly known as Hell's Hollow. Greenwood has often been referred to as the most haunted cemetery in central Illinois.
Another thing people have reported here in the cemetery over the years are what we call the Greenwood spook lights, which occur in the south part of the cemetery, an area that was washed away during the 1920s during a flood. As they brought bodies back, a lot of them couldn't be identified. They were buried in unmarked graves. And shortly thereafter, these little balls of light were reported floating around the cemetery. They're little green balls of light zipping around the hills, and people attribute those to the spirits of the people in those unmarked graves. I don't know that I believe that. I think it's a naturally occurring thing that we can't explain. However, it does tend to freak people out once in a while when they see them. And they're just little balls of light. You can't see them while you're in the cemetery. You got to be outside at the south end. But they are still reported today. So whatever they are, they do tend to spook people.
Crawford County, Illinois, one of the oldest locations in the state. Situated on the eastern edge of Illinois, this county consists of mostly farmland and laid-back living. But old land also holds old legends, old cemeteries, and old tales of the supernatural.
So down here, for South Palestine, there's been a few stories. They're kind of, I don't know if they're urban legends so much, but I know a lot of kids used to come down here to scare themselves a little bit. There's a church up here called Pleasant View, and it's got a bell, and there's 3 crosses out here. And supposedly 3 witches were killed here, buried here, or something. And so if you ring the bell at midnight, it's supposed to ring, and if it rings one less than how many people are in your party, one of you's supposed to die. It's supposed to be the story. So a few years ago, I come down here with my kids, and we rang the bell at midnight like you're supposed to, and it tolled 3 times, and as soon as it stopped, which was weird, 3 birds flew out of the bell after it rang. Well, it freaked everybody out. We took off for the vehicles and drove away.
Our final destination brings us to the middle of Amish country in Chesterville, Illinois, just outside of Arthur. This somewhat secluded community harbors a secret, one that is buried beneath a large oak tree. It's easy to find. Just look for the tree with an iron fence embedded into the trunk. But don't linger, as you may become a victim of a vengeful spirit.
One place I love visiting is the Chesterville Cemetery, but the locals, they don't call it Chesterville Cemetery, they call it Witch Cemetery. And the main legend tells many years ago, a young Amish girl started speaking up about how women were treated in that community. And the elders could not have such disobedience. They wanted to put an end to it. And then a few days later, this young woman went missing. A few days after that, her body was found dead. They put her in the cemetery as a warning to anyone else who was looking at disobeying the elders. And she was buried there as a progressive thinker at that time. And she was placed under a tree. They put an iron gate around her grave to keep her spirit locked in. Trees, actually, although they mark a grave site, they were put up to keep a spirit grounded. The belief was that as long as the tree survived, it would keep that spirit trapped in the ground so it couldn't come back and seek revenge on those who had wronged it in life. And the legend at which grave or which cemetery is that if anything happens to that tree, whether it's blown down, it dies, or it's cut down, it will release the spirit of that witch. Cemetery records indicate that someone is buried in that gravesite, but the name of that person's been lost to history. No one knows who it was. But it must have been a pretty scary person, because not only did they plant the tree above the gravestone, they put an iron gate around the grave marker. Iron gates, which most people think were put up to keep us out, were actually put up to keep a spirit in. The belief was, and is, that ghosts can't pass through iron. So if you were afraid of somebody coming back, maybe somebody you had wronged, you'd put an iron bar on their casket, or you'd put an iron gate around their grave, trapping them to that area. But even though they took a lot of these precautions, it didn't seem to work, because many people claim that this woman, who now has become a witch in legend, haunts the cemetery. And that if you go into the cemetery at night and touch the tree, the spirit of that vengeful witch will chase you out of the cemetery, and you'll be cursed with bad luck until the day you die.